Welcome to the Line Life podcast. I'm Jeff Postlethwaite, Senior Editor of T&D World, and today we're bringing you more stories of the grit, courage, and inspirational teamwork that it takes to be a line worker.
Thanks for tuning in to the Line Life podcast. My name is Amy Fishbach, and I'm the field editor for T&D World magazine. For this episode of the Line Life podcast, we are featuring guest Tim Barat, former line worker turned inventor and CEO, for part one of our new series for the Line Life podcast, Problem Solvers. Tim said that line workers experience challenges every day, and they have the ability to use their skills and knowledge to innovate and create solutions that can make a difference. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here. I appreciate all the work you're doing out here, highlighting the line workers. I think they're the unseen heroes of the grid.
I agree with you completely. I feel like line workers are definitely the unseen heroes. They're first responders, and they do so much to power our communities. And I absolutely love covering the line trade for T&D World. So thank you so much for saying that. So Tim, to begin, I'd like to talk about your career path, which you have said is a non-traditional one. After dropping out of high school at 15, you became an electrician and then a journeyman line worker in Australia, topping out at 18. What attracted you to the trades?
To be honest, it was the pay. I grew up in a very low-income area in Victoria, Australia, and I'd been mowing lawns for $5 since I was 12. I couldn't wait to get out of school and start making some real money, I guess. So I had big dreams to buy new clothes, a bike, a car, a house. But I think most importantly, I just wanted to be free to do whatever I wanted.
And what is the training like for line workers in Australia? Do they go through a 4-year apprenticeship program, or is it handled a different way?
Back when I started, there was no such thing as a licensed line worker. There were kind of two pathways to top out. The first is you get hired by a company, you do 3-4 years of coursework at trade school. And then once you're done with the schooling, the company had to agree that you'd proven yourself in the field. And then you were promoted to what we call in Australia a liney. The other pathway is to become an electrician. In Australia, we call that a sparky. You work on 240-volt wiring and you do almost the same coursework. But then at the end of the apprenticeship, what's different about becoming a sparky is you have to pass 3 exams, and then you receive an A-grade electrician license. And so sparkies often tease lineys that they're smarter because you have to take the exams and you had an official license, whereas a liney didn't. Now they do. That's changed. But that was only recently, I think, in the last couple of years. But the advantage of becoming a sparky first is that you can participate in a 3-month, what's called an electrician to lineman program that allowed you to change over. And this is what I did.
So you're both a sparky and a liney.
That's right.
That's wonderful. And then describe your early years as a line worker in Australia. Who did you work for, and what were some of your primary responsibilities in the field?
I always knew I wanted to work with power from a young age. But out of high school, I decided to become a sparky first instead of a liney because I was afraid of heights.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. After 3 years of working on 240 volts, though, I got bored. So I decided as soon as I got my A-grade license, I'm going to face my fears. I'm going to do something a little more thrilling. I love being outdoors. I was excited to be outside more. And the pay as a liney is also better. So as soon as I got my A-grade license, I got hired by a utility called Gemina, which serves the greater Melbourne area, surrounding suburbs, and I work construction maintenance on distribution.
Perfect. And what were some of your favorite and most challenging parts of working as a line worker? How did you get over your fear of heights, for one?
Well, you get over your fear of heights pretty quickly at line school.
I'm sure you do. Yeah.
I don't know. It's all in the head. Once you're doing it every day, it actually almost feels safe. I had jitters at the beginning, but then it just goes away and it becomes natural. You don't even think about it anymore. But I think my favorite part about the job was the people, the brotherhood, the guys out in the field. No matter what the job calls for, we always had a good time, laughing, teasing each other. And I think also nothing beats having people come out to thank you when you switch their lights back on after trouble. It's very satisfying. I think the most challenging part of the job, especially in Victoria, is the weather. We get 4 seasons a day, almost every day. You have to wear 4 or 5 layers, peel them off as conditions change. So, you'll be shivering at breakfast in the rain, and then by lunch, you've stripped off all your layers and you're burning up in the sun. And then by the afternoon, you can be back to shivering in the rain again. And it literally happens almost every day.
That's really interesting. That sounds like Kansas City, where I'm at right now. It's the same way. It can be like 30 degrees one day and 80 degrees the next day. It's insane. So, what about storms? Did you work a lot of storms when you were a line worker or a liney in Melbourne?
Yeah, it's just part of the job,
Absolutely. So, what is some of the severe weather that you get then in Melbourne?
So I would say it's less severe in terms of the storms. I think the most dangerous conditions come with high winds. So you'll get these, and I'll translate to mile per hour here, but you'll get these 100-mile-per-hour windstorms that come through when it's very, very hot. And we get a lot of grass growing quickly and drying out just because of how the weather is. And so out in the bush with eucalyptus trees, which is basically, like oil, flammable liquid is flowing these eucalyptus branches and leaves. It's just really scary.
I bet. And then, how is line work different in Australia than it is here in the United States in terms of personal protective equipment, work practices, or construction techniques?
A big difference is that we use ladders to climb poles.
Interesting.
Personally, I think climbing with hooks makes a whole lot more sense instead of carrying a big ladder through the bush in a storm. But
Mhm.
I guess it was easier on my knees. Also, Australia has a lot of rural lines. The population of the whole country is the same as the top 5 cities in the US combined. And so you have people spread out. And this means we use a lot of single wire earth return, where you just have a single line. This simplifies a lot of things except protection.
I can imagine. Tim, how do you access these rural areas and out in the bush? Like, do you have special, here, as you know, they have bucket trucks, but what kind of equipment or heavy machinery are you driving to get to these locations?
Yeah, we have trucks. We call it a ute in Australia, basically a short form of a utility vehicle. You can imagine like a Chevrolet truck, but a miniaturized version of that. And yeah, we don't call it this, but you'll have a squirt bucket on the back of that, big fat tires. You get good at driving off road.
Oh, I'm sure. It sounds like you almost need a Jeep or something like that to get on some of those roads. And then what about fall protection? Is it similar to what we have here or is it different?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's taken pretty seriously in Australia. When I was coming up, although we didn't climb, and I'm familiar with this now because I'm in America, but there was this transition between free climbing and the Buckingham squeeze. But yeah, we have our general fall protection, but we use ladders, we have platforms. Sometimes there's steps that we use, but of course, you would get a heavy talking to, you'd get kicked out of the job if you weren't wearing fall protection.
And then I wanted to talk to you about safety. And you said that as a former line worker, you always focus on the safety and security of your fellow workers. How did you stay safe in the field when you were in the line trade? You had mentioned that you had fall protection. What about like clothing or other things that you used or best practices to keep safe?
When I was young, right, and I was low income, I didn't really have a lot of new clothes. I actually liked wearing my uniform. It's like a bright orange uniform. It's super comfy. It's FR rated, and I would like wear it all the time, sometimes even when I wasn't wasn't on call or on shift. Just because people come across you in a totally different way when you're in a uniform. People generally respect and like line workers because they're getting the power back onto them. But I think to answer your question specifically, one of the best ways to stay safe as a line worker is to stay fit, eat clean, sleep well. And when I switched over to line work, I stayed home on weekends. I stopped going out to parties. I didn't drink. I didn't take drugs. You got to have a clear mind. You rock up to the job on Monday morning. You don't want to have a hangover. You're putting your life at risk.
That's absolutely true. And that's really good advice. I know it's a very physical job and that you have to make sure that you're mentally sharp too. And then I wanted to talk to you about wildfires because, of course, we have those here in the US as well. But you had said that when you were in line work, you witnessed the wildfires that burned through Australia in 2009 called Black Saturday. And you said that raging bushfires took the lives of 173 people, injured 414, burned 500,000 acres, consumed 3,500 buildings, and killed more than 1 million animals. If you go back to that time, what was it like for you to experience it personally, and how did it affect you professionally?
Most line workers are generally comfortable with the concept of death. From day one, we're just getting taught all the different ways that we can die. And so we accept that each day can be our last. However, before the fires, I was young, I was naive. I always felt like I was invincible, but that changed after the fires. It was my first real taste of the pain of death, and it kind of changed my view on life forever. Maybe a silver lining is that if you are actually living each day like it's your last, it can actually be a positive thing. But it also ultimately set me on the career pathway I am today. That fire was a life-defining moment, a career-defining moment to me.
And you had said that a study was done by the Victorian government that indicated that aging electrical infrastructure was a contributor to the wildfires. What were your thoughts when you discovered this?
There was a lot of anger and pain after the fires. People were really angry, and rightfully so. They were burying their loved ones. A lot of that anger ended up being directed at the utilities once the report came out, and line workers felt it too. At one point in the conversation, we had to switch to a discussion on preventative shutoffs, and there was a lot of strong opposition in the state to switching the power off for a variety of reasons, but particularly because of the lengthy burden of patrolling lines before they could be re-energized. But I was convinced that if we could perform controlled outages, that this would be the most effective risk reduction strategy. It's just if only somehow we could figure out a way to restore the power faster after the outage had happened.
Sure. And at that time, you were working high voltage and you wanted to make infrastructure safer for line workers and the communities they serve. How were you able to accomplish this by pursuing research and education in California?
Shortly after the fires, I married my wife. She's a California native. So she encouraged me to leave line work for safety reasons and go back to school. But I didn't even have a high school diploma. And so I was able to self-teach myself through a GED. And then I decided to go after electrical engineering at my local community college. And then I was able to transfer to UC Berkeley, and I completed undergraduate and graduate degrees in electrical engineering and computer science. During the course of my time there, my academic career, it became obvious to me that I had, I guess, a responsibility to leverage my field experience and now a newly acquired engineering toolkit to be developing technology for the grid.
Wonderful. And then how did your experience as a line worker impact your research on solving the problem of providing real-time asset monitoring to increase safety and reliability?
At Berkeley, many of my peers, they were focused on electrical monitoring for the grid. Two gaps that quickly emerged for me was, first, the ability to detect high impedance faults, such as a tree laying onto the line. And second, that visibility gap when the grid is de-energized. We literally don't know what's happening when the grid is off. And so most academic and industry research was exclusively focused on electrical monitoring, which they process voltage and current measurements to detect and locate fault conditions. But this approach appeared flawed to me. The prerequisite to detecting these faults using electrical measurements requires that the fault produce an arc. But as a lineman, I had seen trees lay into lines or lines come to the ground and they didn't produce arcs. And so during these events, you have current flowing through the tree or to ground, and it slowly heats up the tree until it combusts into a fire or the line electrocutes someone. This is a huge risk.
Absolutely. And then you relied on your time in the field to find a solution that was easy to install and operate. And then after you couldn't find one, you decided to build your own grid to test technologies. Talk about what that grid looked like and how you designed and built it.
After months of research, I wasn't able to find a single electrical monitoring solution or approach that could reliably detect high impedance faults. And, that was over 6 years ago. But even today, there is still no electrically based monitoring solution that can reliably detect a large tree laying into a line. And this has ignited massive catastrophic fires here in California and throughout the country. And so it's baffling to me that these events are some of the highest risks to wildfire ignition and to public safety, and yet the utilities have no way to detect them. So without a reliable detection method, the only solution is to switch the power off during dangerous weather conditions. So after coming up empty-handed on electrical sensing, I began to question, what if I just build my own full-size grid and I conduct real experiments to see if there's another way to be able to detect these events? So I put in 55-foot poles, 200-foot spans, 125 kVA of generation, transformers, the whole enchilada. And then I basically ran a Mythbusters-style grid laboratory. I was throwing trees on energized lines, cutting live lines with bolt cutters, exploiting transformers, driving cars into poles. Literally every fault you can think of, I've probably done it on my grid hundreds of times. And it's a lineman's dream, I guess.
That is really fascinating. So where did you build this grid, and what did it feel like to blow up the transformers and run the car into poles and do all that?
So it's here in Richmond, California. And, we record every single one of these trials. And basically in every video, you'll hear me laughing.
I want to see some of those videos. That sounds really interesting.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So you recorded then this data on it and what worked and what didn't work, or how did you kind of get to your final product then?
Yeah. So during the course of these trials, we had research grade sensors everywhere on the grid. And we're just looking for what type of signals are we able to observe. And we found that vibration and acoustic signals were unique and clearly visible above noise during every single trial. And you could even tell the difference between each of the fault conditions based on these signals. So then I asked the question, what if we looked at the grid like a giant guitar instead of a circuit board? The lines are strings, the poles are frets, and we essentially place a guitar pickup on the poles to observe these vibration and acoustic signals that can be felt and heard from the pole during fault conditions. And now, since these are mechanical signals, you have visibility during an outage. So fast forward today, we've proven this to be true with 4 of the top 15 largest utilities in the US. We have thousands of sensors deployed across the country, which have accurately and reliably identified hundreds of faults, trees on lines, live lines down, animal interactions, malfunctioning equipment, and even provided real-time damage assessment during storms when the lines are de-energized. So now utilities can respond to high-impedance fault hazards and pre-stage crews or damage during outages, especially if they're doing that preventatively. And so what we achieved is we basically solved both the problems with the same technology that I had set out to solve.
And then you invented the system, secured a patent, and founded Gridware. Can you talk a little bit step by step how the technology works to protect the electric system from wildfires?
So it's centered around a pole-mounted device. It goes halfway up the pole. It's 4 screws, an on button. I like to say our system adopts the 3 design principles. 1, installs faster than a hurt man rescue. 2, it's smaller than a pole step. And 3, the data coming back is simple enough even for a groundman to understand. And if you develop a technology that abides by these 3 principles, it makes it essentially plug and play, and you can deliver the value basically immediately to a utility. And the system processes all this data on a device, and we work directly with the dispatch operators all across the country now to dispatch T-Man to the exact location when something happens, and they know what has happened. So they're taking the right equipment, they're taking the right crews. Often even they're sending the T-Man out in parallel with the construction crew. And so T-Man can start grounding out if a pole has come down or a line has come down. And you've got the construction crew with a pole on the back of the truck getting ready to set it, and you're getting the power on hours faster.
That is really interesting. So, Tim, are line workers the ones who are installing these devices? And how do they determine where they are placed and on which pole?
Union line workers all day, every day, doing every single install. We basically install halfway up the pole. You can install anywhere you like, but generally halfway seems to be a good mix of safety above the ground, prevent tampering, and also speed of installation.
And then how big are the sensors?
Like I said, small in a pole step. We're on a podcast, but I'll hold it up to you here, about as big as a tissue box.
About as big as a tissue box. Okay. Talk about the process of inventing something like that. I mean, did you make modifications along the way? And how do you feel about it kind of being out on the market now?
So I adopted a rapid iteration architecture to our company because when you put the technology out into the world, things are going to change. You're going to learn new things. Your customer's going to ask for certain things. And so we iterate through the hardware every 2 months and we iterate through the software every 2 weeks. And so we're taking real learnings from the field and integrating them into the next design. With this architecture, we were able to race through a lot of the challenges and test the system. How do we survive hailstorms? How do we operate in -20? How do we operate in over 120 degrees? A lot of these questions, 100 mile per hour plus winds, you can design tests, but what if you could just put it out in the real world, work with utility partners to test this? And if there are any ways to improve the system, you're set up as a business to rapidly integrate those learnings.
Is there anything that you have changed based on feedback from the line workers or the utilities?
Yeah, so I remember the first design that we put up, and I'm like the customer, I guess, because as a lineman, I'm thinking about the whole install process. So like the end user for installation is one customer in my mind. And so we had a first version where you had a bracket that was installed first, and then you put the device onto the bracket. And immediately the feedback for the lineman was like, this is stupid. Why don't you just have it all in one? And so you'll see in the current evolution, it's just one unit with the brackets above the device. And then we provide screws. It's just a simple thing, right? We provide the bolts for each device with the device already. And we provide a bit for the drill. Every single box of devices, of 8 devices, comes with a drill bit. And these are just simple things that linemen really appreciate. And also just the hand hold. You can see these places where it makes it easy to hold a device with one hand. That might seem unimportant, but if you're halfway up a pole on hooks, you got one hand on a drill, how are you supposed to hold the device on the pole if it's not easy to hold with one hand? And these are just simple things that people might miss. And that's all feedback that we got from the linemen. So it's built by line workers for line workers.
I love that. And then what is your advice to other line workers who are looking to create an invention and solve a problem in the field?
Before moving to California, I never dreamed of pursuing higher education. Partially it's because I wasn't interested in sitting in a classroom, but I think also it's because I didn't think I would be able to succeed. Initially, I even thought I was moving backwards by going back to school, but fortunately I decided to take the leap and I proved myself wrong. I think there's a huge opportunity to solve some of the biggest problems on the grid with solutions that are just obvious to line workers. And we always spitball crazy ideas out in the field. My advice, if you have an idea, pursue it. As line workers, you have a unique ability to consider practical elements of a solution, like what we talked about, ease of install, which makes it much more likely to succeed.
That's great advice, Tim. Do you have any other comments about your technology or working in the line trade?
I do have a comment. I don't think it's related to either of those two, but I wanted to publicly say this. I was in Colorado recently for a Wildfires conference summit, and I had the privilege of speaking with some of the decision makers at Xcel Energy who made the call to switch the power off preventatively during 100-mile-plus winds a few weeks ago. And there's been a lot of public backlash to those shutoffs, but it pales in comparison to the confusion, the guilt, the anger, and the sadness that Victorians experienced as they buried 173 people who lost their lives during those Black Saturday fires. The weather conditions on Black Saturday were almost the same conditions as those experienced in Colorado. during those shutoffs. But the difference, thanks to the courageous decision of the operators at Excel, now people are having to replace spoiled food in the fridges instead of attending funerals. So I just wanted to publicly say that I support those people that are making these very, very difficult decisions.
No, that's very well said, Tim. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with our Line Life podcast listeners. We hope you'll inspire other line workers to continue to solve problems in the field to make the trade safer and more efficient.
Thanks, Amy. I really appreciate you bringing me onto the podcast.
Thank you.
This episode of the Line Life podcast was written, recorded, and edited by Amy Fishbach. It was produced by Jeff Postlethwaite. That's me. To listen to past episodes, visit www.tdworld.com/podcasts or find us at Podbean. You could also drop us a voice memo or message at linelifepodcast@gmail.com with your comments on this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Please follow this show on Podbean or your favorite podcasting app to be updated when new episodes are released. Thank you for listening.